Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists to report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, activists, social scientists, government and nonprofit leaders. We speak with each one to one. We've all heard about the Harlem Renaissance, that period of literary and intellectual flowering that took place in the 20s and 30s and led to a new level of race consciousness that reached well beyond Harlem. In her new book, Farah Jasmine Griffin, professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia University, writes about yet another period of artistic ferment that was coupled with social and political activism in Harlem, the 1940s, and about three extraordinary women, dancer Pearl Primus, writer Ann Petry, and jazz musician Mary Lou Williams, who personified it. Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists of Progressive Politics During World War II, has just been published by Basic Civitas Books, a member of the Perseus Books Group. Welcome.
Thank you.
So why write about these three women?
Well, they're all very interesting. In some ways, they all embody the time. They cross various art forms. And I think they have a lot to teach us about their time and perhaps about ours too.
Now, Harlem, after the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem was hit very hard by the Depression. What was happening in the 1940s that led to this second period of artistic creativity in Harlem?
I think a few things were happening in Harlem during the 1940s. Well, first of all, World War II came along, and that impacted the entire country, and Harlem certainly was, no less so. There was a new migration of black peoples from the American South and from the Caribbean, as well as people from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So you get a burst of new energy as a result of that migration. And I think that those two factors, the war, the new population coming out of the Depression, led to a new kind of ferment for political activism and also artistic expression. So it's a very exciting place in the early 1940s.
And one of the things, as a result of the war, the men were gone, the women had entree into a whole array of jobs and activity that they had not had before.
Absolutely. Women were taking over jobs that had been done by men because most of the men were gone. Someone like Ann Petry, the writer, can get into a seminar, a very competitive writing seminar at Columbia, and there are no men in the seminar because they're all at war. So that does free up some space for women, but whether it's in the factory or in the newsroom.
Now, Primus was born in Trinidad, and her family moved to New York and ultimately to Harlem when she was a child. Petry, I keep saying Petry, but it was Petry, was from Connecticut and moved to Harlem as a young woman because she married a man from New York. And Williams settled there after years of being on the road as a musician. What was the lure of New York City, and what was the lure of Harlem?
Well, by the 1940s, Harlem is already legendary as a kind of global black capital, and that largely comes about as a result of the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement of the 1920s. So it's already this mythical place. And I think for artists like the ones that I write about, New York is just a place of constant inspiration and stimulation, a place that provides them audiences and venues and publication opportunities. So both Harlem and the city in which it's situated were very attractive to all three women.
Were Primus's parents, were they working class or middle class?
I think they probably were working class who worked their way into the middle class, became property owners. The family eventually would buy property in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is another creative black enclave in Brooklyn. So we see a kind of movement into the middle class. She's college educated, going on to graduate school during the time that I write about her.
Right. She attended Hunter College High School, which was a prestigious school for girls at the time.
Exactly.
And got a degree from Hunter.
Right.
And after holding a number of jobs, odd jobs, including wartime jobs, a riveter, a welder, a switchboard operator, she got a scholarship to the New Dance Group School. What was the New Dance Group?
It was a group of dancers and choreographers that had been founded in the 1930s that tried to link a kind of social consciousness to modern dance, a modern dance aesthetic with a sort of political sensibility. And they were not yet, they were one of the only places where you could take dance classes that were integrated, where black students and white students could take dance classes. And so Pearl got this scholarship and began her dance career there at the New Dance Group.
She debuted in 1943 at the 92nd Street Y, got a glowing review from John Martin?
Yes.
Of the New York Times, and was on her way. What was it about her dancing that was so distinctive?
Well, I think if you read contemporary accounts of her dancing, it's her athleticism that's also coupled with a sense of grace, a sense of beauty. She was known for her leap. She could leap 5 feet in the air. She had been a kind of track and field star at Hunter College. So she combines those two things and presents something unique to the concert stage, both athleticism and grace. And then she has a kind of narrative sensibility. She tells stories through her dance, the dances that she choreographs. And I think all three of those things come together to make her very unique and interesting to John Martin.
Now, it was at Cafe Society, the legendary Greenwich Village nightclub, that she found an ongoing venue. Tell us about Cafe Society.
Certainly. Cafe Society had been founded by a man named Barney Josephson. Again, it was one of the few night spots in New York City that was integrated, where you didn't just have black artists performing for white audiences, you had black and white people in the audience together. You would find all kinds of artists, activists, intellectuals in the audience. Billie Holiday became famous there and sang Strange Fruit there for the first time. Lena Horne, Hazel Scott, Art Tatum, a number of black artists and white artists kind of had their debuts there. Barney Josephson was very supportive of them and also encouraged not only their artistic growth, but a kind of political sensibility as well.
Now, Ann Petry was another college-educated black woman, grew up in Connecticut in a middle-class family, rebelled against working in her family's pharmacy, and sort of escaped by marrying a New Yorker and moving to Harlem. She landed eventually at the People's Voice, which a newspaper that was owned by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. What kind of place was the People's Voice?
The People's Voice prided itself on being a little bit different from the Amsterdam News in that it was more radical, politically radical. And I like to think of it as this place that was just very intellectually and politically exciting. It had a combination of people who ranged politically from communists to liberals. The photographers Morgan and Marvin Smith worked there. You know, it was just a very interesting and exciting new place for young intellectuals to kind of try their voice out in ways that were different from a kind of old standard newspaper like the Amsterdam News.
Now, Petry wrote articles, features, and a kind of society column as well. But it was a short story of hers that was published in the Crisis magazine, the publication of the NAACP, that launched her career. She was noticed by editors at Houghton Mifflin, who gave her fellowship to write, and the product of that was her novel, The Street, which came out in 1946 and sold 1.5 million copies. What was it about Petry's writing, do you think, that captured the public imagination?
Her writing is much like New York itself. It's quick-paced, it's fast, it's very much a page-turner. But Ludi, the character, the protagonist of the novel, is like no one we'd ever seen. We hadn't seen a working-class, single black mother, a woman of great dignity who has great aspirations, as the main character of an American novel. And so she's new to American readers, I think. And at that time, in the 40s, there is a readership that's interested in issues of race, what they would call race relations at the time. We usually see that from the perspective of men. Petry gives it to us from the perspective of a woman.
Right, and she was really in the social realism tradition of Richard Wright, writing about ordinary people and their aspirations and struggles.
Right.
One event that influenced her writing was the Harlem Riot of 1943, sparked off by a riot by the rumor that a black veteran had been shot and killed by a New York City cop, and which led to, rioting that destroyed a lot of property and left 6 black people dead. What was the impact of that riot on Harlem and on your subjects?
Well, I think the impact on Harlem was, a real sense that in spite of the sort of optimism of the moment, that there were real genuine concerns that people had around police brutality, around the treatment of black soldiers all over the country, around, poor housing stock that was available to them, many kinds of social issues. So it was a really explosive moment. It impacted it economically because after the riot, some of the businesses didn't open. Some of the people who had patronized much of the nightlife no longer patronized it. Petry herself would leave Harlem shortly after the riots and move to the Bronx. Mary Lou Williams, my third subject, stays after it. But I think it affects all of them and certainly affects the imaginative work that Petry does. So she writes a short story about it.
Right. When Mary Lou Williams moved to Harlem in 1943, and 1943 seemed to be a pivotal year, a big year for all of them, she was already an established musical star. She had been born to a very poor family in Atlanta. They migrated to Pittsburgh when she was a small child, and in Pittsburgh she was a musical prodigy, and who got her start like a lot of black musicians and entertainers, sort of on the traveling circuit. She traveled with these various bands around the country, and then after a decade of travel, she found an apartment on Hamilton Terrace in Harlem, which brought her a kind of stability, you said. Cafe Society played a big role in her life as well, right?
Yes, it did. Barney Josephson hired her as well in Cafe Society. So this is after a decade of being on the road constantly, with the Territory Band and the Andy Kirk Orchestra. She not only has an apartment and a home that she can settle in, she has a place where she's kind of in residence. That's her place. And it gives her time to stretch out and explore. And so some of her first long-form compositions begin to come together while she's playing at Cafe Society because it gives her stability for the production of her art.
And she actually she moved to the Uptown Cafe Society and was really a star of that venue, right?
Very much so. She was absolutely a star. I mean, I think she was a star amongst many black music lovers when she moves to New York because it's big news when she gets here. But
and let's say she's a pianist primarily.
Right, primarily a pianist and an arranger and a composer, had done arrangements for Duke Ellington. But when she gets to Cafe Society, that's really when her star explodes. She gets a weekly radio show here in New York. She gets various kinds of contracts, and all kinds of things begin to open for her.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with more with Farah Jasmine Griffin, author of Harlem Nocturne. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Farah Griffin, the author of Harlem Nocturne. There are a lot of musicians, there are a lot of jazz musicians. What was it about Mary Lou Williams' music?
I think that Mary Lou was unique in that she played through almost every style development in the 20th century. You could hear stride piano in her playing, boogie woogie in her playing, bebop in her playing. And even later in her career, when music took the kind of turn toward the avant-garde, she could play that music as well. One could listen to her and hear a whole history of jazz piano in her playing. In addition to her playing, she did these extraordinary compositions, each of them very textured and unique, different from the other. And she arranged for people like Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington, certainly making her very unique amongst women. I can't think of maybe Melba Liston later on. So I think that combination, composer, arranger, and incredible player, made her in the top echelon of jazz musicians.
Now, she became a kind of mentor to the bebop musicians who were coming along, and her Harlem apartment was a kind of musical salon for them?
Yes. It was a musical salon. Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, all of Bud Powell would come and play on her piano and try out some of their compositions, play them for her. She would critique their compositions. She'd work with them on them. And it wasn't only musicians. I mean, it was writers and artists who would come to that Hamilton Terrace apartment. And she liked creating that kind of atmosphere where creative people could come together and just be in community together.
You write that all three women, both Primus, Petry, and Williams, used their art as a kind of social and political statement about how African Americans were being treated at the time. Would you describe them as activists?
I certainly would describe them as activists, some more so than others. I mean, I think Pearl Primus and Ann Petry fit our definitions of activists in that they were very much engaged in political organizing, in political organizations. Petry helped to create and found an organization for women, for Harlem Housewives. So I think they fit a definition of activism that we have. Mary Lou Williams later on, after the Harlem riots, and she takes a break from playing every night at Cafe Society, she looks around and she becomes an activist too, because she wants to know what can she do to better her community. And she tries to fight against segregation. She tries to work within the school system. So all of them were activists. They didn't see a separation between being artists and activists.
All three women had a lot of interactions with communists. Petry at the village, at the People's Voice, where it seemed like most of the staff were communists.
Yes.
Primus and Williams at Cafe Society, and in other circles they were a part of. Were they communists themselves?
The only one who was a member of the Communist Party is Pearl Primus. She was actually a member of the party. Ann Petry never was a member and made very clear that though she associated with communists, she didn't always agree with the tenets of communism. Mary Lou Williams was not affiliated with the party at all. I think that it's not so surprising that they were, kind of surrounded by communists, because it wasn't as big of a taboo. It would become a taboo later in the decade. But by the early 40s, even Adam Clayton Powell is receiving the endorsement of communists. By the late 40s, he kind of purges all the communists from the People's Voice.
In 1944, Primus embarked on a tour of the South in search of material for her dance. She even disguised herself as a field worker so she could, really find out what was going on in the field. She visited the sharecroppers' churches. How did her Southern tour influence her dancing?
It influenced the actual movements, the kind of movement vocabulary that she brought back, the way that people might get happy in the church, the way an arm might fly over their head as they're bringing it down to chop cotton. All of these movements she brought back with her, and so you actually can see them in the choreography. Mm-hmm. It influenced the way that she told stories. She danced to Strange Fruit, the song made famous by Billie Holiday.
Which is about a lynching.
Which is about a lynching. And she goes there, and one of the things that's interesting is that she encounters both black and white Southerners. And she realizes that things are much more complex than her sense as a Northerner was of, these are the bad people, these are the good people. And so she makes that dance. She says that she creates that dance not around the black person who was lynched, but around a white woman who had been a member of the mob and witnessed it. And so we get that woman's humanity and how it affects her. So I think that trip, later her trips to Africa would do this for her, but that trip was one of the first ones that really influenced her sense of bringing together her political sensibilities and her artistic sensibilities.
Primus was always overshadowed by Katherine Dunham, another black dancer. I guess the only other major black modern dancer of that time. Why was that?
Well, I think Dunham, she had her own company for a longer and more sustained time. She had her own school. She was able to do things. She started dancing much earlier than Pearl did, and so she was able to kind of institutionalize herself in ways that Pearl Primus did not at the same time. Pearl Primus would do it much later on. And also she was in Hollywood movies. She was a very kind of glamorous, she fit a certain beauty standard of the day, so she was not only an amazing dancer and choreographer, she was also able to garner a more popular audience because she did nightclubs and she did the movies. She's in Stormy Weather. So I think that all of those factors came to play.
Okay. Now when bebop began to overtake swing and Williams found it eventually harder to find work, she undertook a European tour, and she also tried to organize an interracial concert in Atlanta.
Right, so before she left for Europe, she'd been born in Atlanta, and she tried to organize an interracial tour of women musicians to really desegregate, parts of the place of her birth. It did not work. She tried to garner support. It didn't work, but that was something that she thought music could actually bring people together, and by bringing them together, break down some of these artificial barriers that had been placed. But that didn't work. So eventually she left and she went to Europe. She toured through England and France before coming back to New York.
Mm-hmm. Did Primus, Petry, and Williams know each other?
Primus and Williams knew each other through Cafe Society. They even worked together, dancing and writing music together, and they knew each other for years. You can find in their archives photographs that they autographed to each other. Petry seems not to have known them, or I haven't found any evidence. I keep thinking that I'll find evidence at some point that she knew them as well, but I have yet to find evidence that she knew either of the other two women.
Petry, so Harlem was never really recovered from the riots, correct?
It did not. I mean, it would have a new generation would come and it would take on a new energy, but it's certainly not during the period about which I write. It takes quite some time before we see a sense of recovery for Harlem.
And the end of the war led to a sort of contraction of what was the impact?
So interesting things happened. On the one hand, many of the fights that people waged during the war to desegregate, even residentially desegregate a place like New York, meant that when other areas of the city opened up, those people who were able left Harlem and moved to places like the Bronx or to Queens. And Mary Lou Williams never left. And then we get, by 1949, we get things like the Urban Renewal Acts, which build projects that had not existed before in Harlem. So the landscape begins to change a little bit after the war. It's both, it brings many pluses, but I think the community also suffers some.
But that after the war was when Harlem began to take on more of the aspects of the urban slum, right?
It certainly was, that's the way that it was talked about. Petry even talks about it. She says in one of her final pieces about Harlem, she says Harlem is a ghetto, and for what that means, where people are segregated, and it becomes a way of thinking about managing Harlem as a kind of set of urban problems.
So Petry and her husband moved back to Connecticut, where she continued writing. Primus moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant, where she eventually got a PhD in dance and became a college professor, university professor. You said that she actually had a gambling problem for a while, but was...
Mary Lou Williams did,
I'm sorry,
right.
Mary Lou Williams.
Right.
I don't want to get the wrong one.
Right.
But she continued to perform, played concerts for public schools, cared for musicians who had substance abuse problems, and actually played at Carnegie Hall in the 70s. Right. And she was the one who stayed in Harlem, Mary Lou Williams.
Mary Lou stayed in Harlem. Even after, in the 70s, she got a job, one of the first jazz musicians to get a job at a university, at Duke University. So she bought a house in Durham, but she kept that apartment in Hamilton Terrace. She always came back to Harlem.
Okay. We've got about a minute and a half for you to sum up the legacies of these three women.
Oh, they left us many legacies. The Black women writers who explode in the 70s can look to Ann Petry as a kind of foremother, creating a way for them. Mary Lou Williams, not just for women jazz musicians, I think for all jazz musicians, has been a kind of role model, but particularly for people like Jerry Allen. And for the Black dancers and choreographers like Alvin Ailey, Ron K. Brown, the women of Urban Bush women, all follow in the footsteps of Pearl Primus.
Very interesting. I learned a lot about these three women who I had heard about, but did not know as much about.
Well, thank you for taking the time to read the book.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'd like to thank Farah Griffin for joining us today. Harlem Nocturne has just been published by Basic Civitas Books, a member of the Perseus Books Group. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.